welcome to, I guess, the first real lab session. I'm going to assume at this point you've already installed Jupyter Lab. Ideally, you've watched the video that gives you a little bit of an orientation to Jupyter Lab if you're not already familiar with notebooks. So I'm going to jump right in and open up my first notebook here. So this is the launcher in Jupyter Lab, and I'm going to open a new notebook by double-clicking on that. And there you go. I'm already in my notebook. So what are the things I can do? If you watch that first video, the orientation video about Jupyter Lab, you already know that what I'm looking at right now is a cell. And anything that I type into this cell is going to get executed by the Python interpreter. And it's going to print out the last thing that I've typed into this cell. So for example, I can say 3 plus 2 and hit enter, and nothing happens because it's still waiting for further input. And I can say 5 plus 5 and I hit enter, still nothing happens. And then I can say 99 plus 5. And this time, instead of hitting enter, I'm going to hit shift enter or shift return. And you will see it prints 104. Now, what really happened was all of those lines of code were executed, but it's only printing out the value of the last line. So for example, I think we talked about in class, we had a stock that we bought at $10 and we sold at 12. And we said that's about a 20% return. So we said, let's try that. So 12 minus 10, whoops, divided by 10. And there you go. I hit shift enter, and so I got 0.2. If I want to see that as a percent, I can just go, now what I'm going to do is I'm going to hit up arrow, and it's going to take me back to that cell. And if you see there's that number 2 here, that means that was the second thing that was executed. And I'm going to multiply that by 100 because I want to see it as a percentage, right? So I do 100 times this. Again, I hit shift enter. Watch what happens there. That changed to 20, which is good. That should not have surprised you. And if you noticed here, that number changed to 3. And that's just telling you that was the third thing that was executed. And you see that the second thing that was executed, you cannot see that anymore. All right, so what we're really doing here is we're just typing in expressions that we're sending to the Python interpreter to evaluate. All we're doing here is just using Python as a sort of glorified calculator. And obviously we want to do more interesting things with it. So what is the first thing you can do with it? Well, these values that we're calculating, we might want to store that in memory so that we can access them through variables. So variable assignment is probably the most important thing. So let's name these things. So let's see how we can do that. Let's give names for the purchase price. So I'm going to call it purchase price was $10, right? My sales price was $12. And so now what is my profit? My profit is the sales price minus the purchase price, right? And now I'm going to type in something and it's going to do something weird. So watch what's going to happen. So I want to now compute my return. So I'm going to say return is assigned, let's call it profit divided by sales price. Okay. Now I'm actually not going to hit enter because I want you to see what's going on here. If you look at the variable name I've given, return, you see that that is being treated a little differently. It looks a little different from the rest of the stuff. Why does it look different? Because it turned green. Well, what's going on there is it turns out that some words in Python are special words. They are keywords. They're words that the Python interpreter is going to interpret as a very specific thing. And we're going to come to return exactly what return is in a very short amount of time. But you can, the main point I want to make is you should not name your variables things that are special to Python. return is one of those, unfortunately. So at this point, since we don't know all the keywords in Python, it's not very useful for me to tell you, well, don't name your variables things that are keywords because you don't know all the keywords. But what you do see is these keywords do get recognized when you type them in. Jupyter Lab is smart enough to color code these keywords. And whenever you see something like that happening, that's a sign to you that you really shouldn't be doing this. You shouldn't call your variable by that. So what can you call your variables? In general, I'm going to suggest that you call your variables something very simple and follow a very simple convention. Start with a lowercase letter and then follow up with letters, numbers, that is digits, and underscores. So return is probably not a good idea because return's a keyword. Let's call this something like percent return. Right? Now you see that's not a problem. And I'm going to hit Shift Enter. And it's executed all that code. And there's nothing to print because the result of an evaluation, the result of evaluating an assignment is really not anything that it can print. But what I can do now is I can say percent return. I can just type that in and I hit Shift Enter and it will tell you, well, here was the percentage return. And you can see right away that I've clearly made a mistake because we were expecting a 20% return, but this thing is telling me that I got a 16% return. What happened? Well, obviously, when you go look at this code, you'll see that I made a mistake. What was the mistake? The profit that I computed is correct. So let's just make sure that the profit is what we expect it to be. So I hit profit, hit enter, and that's 2, and that's exactly correct. But the percentage return I had typed in as profit divided by sales price, which of course is wrong. The percentage return is the profit divided by the purchase price. So a large part of writing code is debugging. And I hate to break this to you, but writing code isn't all that hard. But reading code and debugging it to figure out what went wrong, where is the error, that can be very, very hard. And this is a perfect example of something that can catch you when you least expect it. And you can imagine that going back and figuring out what the source of this error was, in this case, it was obvious, but in some other cases might not be. So a good exercise is, and I'm going to keep executing, and there you go. So a good exercise would be to make sure that you name your variables something really descriptive so that it's obvious. In this particular case, it was obvious that my percentage return was profit divided by sales price was just plain wrong. So just having good variable names goes a long way towards making your code a little easier to debug. All right, let's get to doing some more interesting things. So this is essentially an expression that is a numeric expression, but of course Python has other expressions. Python has support for strings. Python has support so you can give string expressions. So let's actually use that and use this as an opportunity to also call a function. So Python has built-in functions. So printing out something is something that you want to do often. And you might say the profit from that trade, from the trade, was profit, right? So what's going on here, let's make this a little more interesting. And the return was percent return. All right. So I'm going to hit Shift Enter, and you see all it did was print it. So what really happened here was that we called a function, which was a built-in function in Python called print, and print takes a series of arguments. In this example, I gave it 1, 2, 3, 4 arguments, and all it does is takes the arguments and it just prints out on the console the 4 arguments separated by spaces. So you notice I did not put a space after the was, but you see there is a space here. All right. So This is an example of calling a function. We could do something more interesting. For example, we could give an expression there instead of just a variable. So for example, let's say I want to show that as a percentage return. So I would say times 100, right? And I hit enter, and you'll see that it says the profit from the trade was 2 and the return was 20%. All right. If you want to make it nice and look even better, you can give it percent. There you go. All right. So what are the other kind of expressions? Well, certainly you can have numeric expressions, as we've seen, and Python has a very rich set of operators to help you do math. So you can do things like to the power, so that's exponentiation, so with the double star is exponentiation. That gives you 32. You can do modulo arithmetic. So for example, 24 modulo, that's the mod. Modulo, let's say 8 will give you 0. There you go, 0. But if you say 24 modulo 7, you'll get 3. That's because 24 is 3 times 7 plus 3. So modulo essentially gives you the remainder. I can also do integer division. So for example, 24 / 7 will give you 3. But if I do 24 just divided by 7, I'll get standard division. All right. Let's try and reproduce some of the numbers we talked about in class. I think I'd taken the example of a daily return that had to be annualized. So what did we say? We said we had a, let's do it as an expression. So let's say my return was 0.001. Whoops, 001, right? Okay, so now I want to annualize this, and let's say that was a daily return. So I want to do 1 plus r, and I want to exponentiate this. If you remember, the expression is 1 plus r to the power of exactly how many periods you have in that year. This is a daily return, so I'm going to raise that to the 252nd power. So, and then I subtract 1, right? And I get a 28.64% return. So let's say I had a 4% return per quarter. So I'll go there and I'll make that 0.04, enter. And now let me reevaluate that. So that will give you, I have to change that to quarterly. So that means I have 4 periods per year. And that will give you about a 16.9% return. And let's take one last example. Let's say I change my, I had a 1% return, but that was per month. So how many periods would I have per year? To annualize it, that would be 12. I hit enter. And I get a weird number. Now, why is that? That's because when I went in, I typed in R is assigned 0.01, but I did not hit shift enter. So it used the old value of R. We need to fix that. Execute that line. So that is now, R is now 0.01. And then I do 1 plus R to the power 12 minus 1, and I get 12.68%. All right, good. I think that's about as much as we should try and do for now. Tomorrow we'll look at other kinds of expressions, Boolean expressions. We'll look at strings, and then we'll start looking at more interesting ways to work with the language by defining our own functions. So that's what I have planned for next class. See you then.